it was a very integral part of my childhood. So I included that in the first chapter of the book. I talk about Mr. Brown. And included this from the unknown artist who drew this based on his description of what he saw. The interesting thing about what he saw was the creature that he saw had a limp arm. It seemed to be injured. I think he even described it as though it had a stroke. You know, it kind of had a limp arm. And as this creature puffed at it and gruffed and walked off, it had a limp on the same side of its body, which I found very compelling. That he went into such detail. Because, of course, it was a small town. He went back into town and told people that he ran into the street, right? And people were like, didn't have a lie, and they're like, sure, Mr. Brown, so creature, right? It's interesting that he had those details. And that's one of the things that sticks out to me as I talk to people in these encounters. These strange details that stick out that make you go, how did somebody come up with it? It's like the beach thing, right? We talked about that earlier. People say, why would they fake a female Bigfoot in 1967 that would infect kind of thing? It just doesn't make sense. And when things don't tend to make sense, there's usually something else to it. So that story always stuck out to me as very integral in my childhood. But as we tend to do, we have interests as kids. Sometimes we read comic books, sometimes we like certain shows. We grow out of that as we go. As I went through life, I grew up to become a police officer. That's something I always wanted to do, and I realized that when I was a city of Atlanta cop. I was in law enforcement for 16 years. And guess what I didn't do when I was a cop? I didn't talk about Bigfoot. I didn't talk about my UFO experiences, because people kind of look at you like you got 3 minutes when you talk about that stuff, right? And as a police officer, you got to prosecute crimes. I did a lot of DUI and those kind of things. Those lawyers are tough. People pay good money to get them off of DUIs. I didn't want to be known as the guy that was into the weird stuff, right? Because they'll stalk your Facebook and see you talking about Bigfoot, and the next thing you know, it's being brought out of court. So I didn't really talk about that for a long time. But then, after I got to the point where I was out of law enforcement in 2016, I moved into you're the man. Next slide. We joked about me saying that last night, just in case you flickered it. So, I was in the city of Atlanta. It would be akin to being in the middle of London, right? Not too many Bigfoot in the area, so I always wanted to live in the woods. I wanted to be in a place where there was a possibility of me having my own experiences with these things. So, left the police department in 2016 and ended up looking for land. We wanted land. Huge chunk of land, as much as we could possibly get. So we ended up doing a one-day land sale in the state of North Carolina and purchased our first 20 acres of property. That is actually the raw property. Not too long after we purchased it, that is our 78 Volkswagen bus. And we would go keep them out on the property and plan our future home site, those kind of things. And I'll be honest, people have asked me, did you buy the property thinking about Bigfoot? The answer is absolutely yes. We looked at the area around it, and not only, we tried to buy 2 parcels of land that day, we ended up with the first 20 acres, and somebody else had bought the other land around us, so we had to wait about a year and a half after we purchased the first parcel of land for that to come over, and we were able to eventually end up on it. We have roughly 40 acres of property. And we weren't there full time until probably 2.5 years into owning the property. But we ended up, I put that in there just because I looked really cool. I thought trying to chop a log. I thought y'all would enjoy that. We eventually pulled a 400 square foot tiny house. That's actually the house that we live in now, on the property where it sits. But before that, we lived off-grid for a year and a half on the property. No running water, no indoor toilet. It's rough living. But eventually, we did move. Once we got the house there, we moved onto the property. We started cutting out trails. We have 3 dogs. So we walk the dogs every day, at least a couple of times a day. And we hadn't really had any kind of activity other than, I'd say, the first fall that we were there, we had vocalizations. Are you guys familiar with the Ohio howl kind of sound? Matt Moneymaker, that big long, it almost sounds like an air raid siren. Matt Moneymaker recorded, I think, in 92 or 94. We had a hot tub on the front of the house that we saw in that area, about where that machine was pulling the house down the driveway. But we had a hot tub, and the first thing that happened on the property was, besides the strange lights that we had periodically, I'd say the first thing that we heard that was Bigfoot related was this Ohio howl type sound. Now, if you can picture, I should have put an overhead view of like Google Earth. There's literally nothing around us. In addition to our 40 acres, there's about 400 acres of nothing but forest behind us. And I'd say for another 60 to 80 acres on either side of us and in front of us, there's nothing but woods. We're completely surrounded by forest. And this is big ridge behind the back of our property. We were in the hot tub, just chilling, having a glass of wine. And we hear this Ohio howl kind of sound way off in the distance behind the ridge. You know, you hear those things, you're like, it could be a coyote, it could be a wolf, it could be a big cat, something like that. Didn't think much of it, but I said, I kind of filed that away. It sounded like the Ohio. We heard that a couple of times at first. I'd say fall going into the next season of that first year. And then I started a podcast. I was very interested in the subject. I wanted to talk to people who had experiences. And I wanted to do it in the southeastern United States. I didn't want to talk to people in the Pacific Northwest. I didn't want to talk to people anywhere else. I wanted to talk to people in Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida. Because I was interested in those encounters because I grew up in those areas. So in 2021, I started a podcast, Sasquatch Odyssey, because I started interviewing people. And I was like, I want to document this. I want to have a way to share this with other people who might be interested in hearing the same stories. So when I started the show, I started interviewing people. I got into Facebook groups. I joined about 600 Bigfoot groups, right? I started talking to people. I'm like, hey, if you had an experience with Bigfoot, I'd love to talk to you. And people started emailing me. And I started recording these conversations with their permission, of course. And I was like, how can I get this out there for people to hear? Well, the best way to do it is a podcast. So I started Sasquatch Odyssey in February of 2021. And by March of 2022, I left my full-time job to become a full-time podcaster. But I also had time to get out into the woods and explore back to the property. So I'm walking the dogs around this tract of land. It's probably a couple of acres that we walk every morning with the dogs. Same thing every day. And there's this one particular area where there's an old cedar stump, which you guys will see here shortly. And the first weird thing that happened was, this is a little out of order, so I'm going to go to the first thing that happened. Okay, so I'm walking the dogs along the property, and here's this cedar stump that would be from me to you, off the path. I walked it the day before, there was nothing there. And I come around the path, and this is what I find. It's a bleached white turtle shell stuck into the side of this fence. No, it's really weird. I wasn't there yesterday. It wasn't there in the evening. This was the morning walk that I took with the dogs, and there's this turtle shell sticking out of the stump. And I'm thinking, that is really strange. I'm like, how? And mind you, this is, I don't know how many hundreds of yards off from where the house is onto the back of the property. Like, there's nobody there with us, right? So I started doing a little research, what we all do. I got into Facebook groups, I started Googling, and I started looking into turtle shells and Bigfoot. And then I found gifting sites where people were saying this was turning up. They were having turtle shells turn up on gifting stumps, sometimes feathers, sometimes nuts, sometimes other things, rocks inside them. And this did have some debris in it, but I don't think that was fit for purpose. Just my opinion. I don't know for sure. But I'm seeing this and I'm thinking, I start posting about it on Facebook. People are like, yeah, that's a thing. I think something's gifted. Are you guys, anybody familiar with gifting and Bigfoot? You heard of gifting before? Basically, in a nutshell, you're leaving something for what you believe to be Bigfoot. They're taking it and they're sometimes leaving things in return, right? So I thought, how can I test this theory? So back to these things. The first thing that I left out was some peanut butter. We eat sun butter, ground up sunflower seeds. I was leaving jars of those, and I was having them taken. Something was taking them out of the middle of that sun. Completely disappeared, they were gone, lit and all. I found nothing, right? So I knew people were using apples to gift. So I was like, we had a couple of apples that were kind of going bad. I don't like eating mushy apples. So as the apple was going bad, I decided to take it out. So I took it out to the gifting stump. I stuck it on the stick that you see there. And I stuck it in the middle of the stump. And I was like, maybe Bigfoot. If it is Bigfoot, maybe they like apples. I don't know. So I left it there. First day, nothing. Walked the dogs around, checked the apple. It was fine. Put up a trail camera facing the stump. I pulled the SD card every morning. I would check the SD card to see what was there or not there. Apples not touched. Pull the SD card. I find raccoons. 2 or 3 raccoons coming up to the stump. They're not touching the apple. They're not messing with the apple. But there's raccoons. Okay. At least we're getting something, right? So, third day in, I come around the corner, I see the stump, but the apple is tilted a little bit on the stick. It's still sticking on the stick, it's still in the stump, but it's tilted a little bit. I'm thinking, that's weird. Maybe something tried to get it. So I walk over to the apple, and that's what I see. It looks like something picked the apple up on the stick and took a bite out of this nasty apple and stuck it back into the stump. That is really weird. So I took a couple of photos, these photos that you see, and I sent them to a couple of people. I sent them to Doug Highchip, and I sent them to my co-host that Bigfoot podcast, Wayne, and I just, no explanation, I just said, tell me what you think that is. What does that look like? And immediately they responded back. It looks like something, Wayne said, it looks like he took a bite out of a nasty apple. Yeah, I didn't do that. Something did, right? So, Doug said the same thing. It looks like something took a bite out of the apple. So I go to pull the SD card out of the camera that was facing the apple. There's no photos, there's no videos of anything touching the apple. At all. No raccoons, no nothing. It's just the apple's there the whole time, and then there's bites taken out of the apple. Really strange. So I continue to put stuff out on the stump. Nothing else really happened. Things would take the sun butter, something would take the sun butter. Nothing ever left anything in its place, it was just gone. And I tried the apple experiment several other times. Nothing happened. And of course, I'm an Occam's razor kind of guy. It's probably a deer, it's probably something that's known that took the bite out of the apple. I just don't know how it happened. Because we're talking, it's like this far off the ground. It's a very low stump. A deer would have to come and turn its head. I don't even know how to do it. Not saying it's Bigfoot, but I found it really strange. So the next thing that happened was I'm walking the dogs along this path. Same path that the apples off of. This is farther down the path. And it bends back around near the creek and it goes back to the house. We're probably 75, 80 yards away from our house at this point. And this is what I see in the middle of the path. It had rained a couple of days before, the ground was still moist, you can see. The substrate here, where the footprint is, low spot, it's really muddy. There's just one footprint, which is the one you see. I'm like, that is really weird. It wasn't there yesterday, but now it's there, right? So, that's the first footprint that I found. I cast that footprint. If you guys follow me on Instagram, Bigfoot BKS, you can see the casting video, the first photos that I took of this, and the whole process of casting it. Cast turned out pretty good, but I set it on the porch to let it dry overnight. We have chickens, and one of my chickens flew up on the porch and knocked it off and broke it in 4 places. I saved it, it's still there, but it's not as good as it used to be. If you have the book, you can see the photos of it broken in the book. I may have included one in here for you to see in a second. Really strange footprint, but it almost looks like 5 toes bigger than me, right? I wasn't walking barefoot, and this is about 13 and a half, 14 inches long. My foot is the size of 11. I have the biggest foot on the property. It definitely wasn't me walking around barefoot. That's another cast that I made, not of that particular footprint. I was trying to get to that particular one so you can see it. So I'll go back to these. In addition to that footprint that you see there, there's some of the other casts that I've done. They're all a little bit different. And around, so these would be about a year and a half ago, is the oldest. That was sort of like a half. That was actually going up an embankment, or the side of an embankment on the property. It's really difficult if you're good at casting to try to cast going uphill or downhill. It's not the easiest thing in the world. That's why the cast turned out to be kind of crappy. That one, same area, just a different spot in the general area where we walk the dogs, which is always interesting to me because I've had the dogs react to some of these spots, and that drew me over, and that's when I found these prints, which I've always thought was kind of interesting. Come on. There we go. So this is one of the latest. Well, actually, we found a trackway about 3 weeks ago. This was last October. So, interesting part about what these prints here, these casts that you see. This is about 65 yards from the house. And an interesting thing about these is, it's in an area where we have a small chicken coop, where we've raised babies and had babies hatched on the property. We leave them in this small coop in this area. And then we move them into the bigger coop, and then we eventually let them free range, all of our chickens free range on the property. The interesting thing about where these were found, again, 65 yards away from the house, it was in an area where we had ducks at one time. Predators took care of them, unfortunately, the rest of their souls are no longer with us. We had ducks at the time, we were trying to dig out like a 6-foot area. It's probably like 6 foot this way, kind of P-shaped or kidney-shaped area. It was about 4 feet wide. And the interesting thing that drew me to find these was we had this small pail of chicken food that we could keep out there, this metal pail, almost like a full-size garbage pail, but it's about yay high, about 14 inches around. And we had to put a bungee cord over the top of it because something kept taking the top off. Probably raccoons is what I thought. So we put the bungee cord on it so we couldn't pull the lid off anymore. But something was picking the bucket up and moving it sometimes 30 feet. I would come out almost every morning for a week, and something would pick the bucket up and move it from here to there, and just left it. Sometimes it would be on its side, sometimes it would be sitting up, like something just picked it up and moved it. So I walk out on the porch one morning and I see the bucket, and I'm like, something's moved the bucket again. So I go trudging off to get the bucket and put it back where it goes. And I walked across where we had dug out this pond area, and it rained a couple of days before, it washes down into this pond area, so it was very moist. And it was nothing but filled up with dirt from the debris that washed down with the rains. And this is what I found. There's 2 footprints. There's a right and a left, and the stride is probably 46, 50 inches between the 2 footprints. And that's what I cast. I pulled it out. So, and I have to be honest with you, you saw those first couple of casts, right? There's a big difference in that, and that. I didn't tell you that. I sat on it for weeks. I cast it, I pulled the cast out, I saw how it turned out, and I didn't tell anyone. I sent it to some people that I trust. Doug, I sent it to Cliff Bergman, I sent it to Wayne, a couple of other people. I sent them photos. But I said on these photos, I didn't put them out publicly until the book came out in March of this year. Because they turned out too good, right? Because I'm thinking at this point, and I've talked about this very candidly on the show in the past, I'm the Bigfoot podcast thing, right? I talk to people, it's how I make a living, and now I have property where there's possible Bigfoot too. I know how that works, right? So I didn't put it out there because these turned out too good. And I did a speaking gig, I did a conference out in Idaho last summer. It was me, Dr. Jeff Duncan, who you guys are going to hear from here shortly, and Cliff Bergman from Finding Bigfoot was there, Michael Freeman, who was Paul Freeman's son. We were all sitting around having drinks at night. And I mentioned the prints that I was finding, and Cliff said something that stuck with me. He said, look, dude, if you're finding real Bigfoot prints, 95% of what you cast is going to turn out to look like what I showed you first. He said, but when you find something like that, it's like the holy grail, right? But you should cast everything that you find. So I've done that from then on. And eventually I said, I'm going to put this in the book and talk about it because I'm going to share whatever it is. I don't know that Bigfoot made these tracks, but I don't know what else it would be. So they're about 14 and a half to 15 inches long, and 7.5 to 8 feet or 7.5 to 8 inches at their widest, as far as the widest. Oh, that's the original one I was. That the chicken broke. Chickens are responsible for that missing part, this missing part, and that breaks. Gotta love the chickens. And I think she got got by a predator the rest of her soul. Okay, so a couple of shots back, we saw the photo of one of the casts. That was actually the photo before I cast the print, so you can kind of see what I was working with. It was very, very thin, not a whole lot there, very dry substrate. Dave messaged you, correct, just in case you were wondering. So, in addition to finding the footprints and being able to cast that, the weird things that were happening with the stumps, vocalizations that we heard, I guess the next big thing was I started the podcast, I'd done some work, had some interviews. It was about 10:30 at night. It was really nice outside. It was probably 50 degrees, so our loft in a tiny house you probably saw in the photo is nothing but windows. So we had the windows open. I was doing some show notes, winding down for the evening. Windows open, and we hear what sounds like the Ohio howl. But this time it's like 40, 50 yards into the woods, really close. We not only heard it, but we felt it. You heard people talk about that on shows, podcasts, whatever. It's almost impossible to describe if you've never had that sensation of having a vocalization like that, but we felt it. I won't say it rattled the windows, but it certainly felt like it. And I was like, that was really close. Really close. Again, it was one of those things. People have asked me, I've been guest on other podcasts, and I've talked about it on my show before. People have asked me, hey, did you go outside to see what it was? No, I didn't. I'm not stupid. I'll be honest with you. I don't want to come face to face with something that makes that kind of noise at 10:30 at night on my property. I just don't. How do you know it wasn't a person? I don't. But I live in North Carolina. North Carolina is a little different than the UK. North Carolina is a little different than New York. It's different from some of the other cities in the United States. Everybody in North Carolina has a gun. Sometimes they're long, sometimes they're big, sometimes they're pistols, but everybody has a gun. And I'm telling you something, we have what's called a purple paint law. So if you have the exterior of your property, you paint trees at a certain height with purple paint, it lets everybody know if you're not invited here, you're not welcome here. And if you come on the property uninvited, there'll probably be what we call stag singing and flower bringing for your family. Because you're probably going to meet, you get the picture. So no, I don't think it was a person 50 yards into my woods, which would be a couple of hundred yards off the nearest road where they could have access to properties. I don't know. Again, I've never said it's Bigfoot, but I don't know what else is Bigfoot. But in addition to that, I started noticing on some hikes. We try to hike the property often. There's still places, 40 acres is not huge, but there's still places on my property that I've never been. So we try to hike a different area every time we go hiking. And it seems every time we go hiking, we find things that I've never seen before. This is an example. Again, you'll never hear me say anything during this presentation about this is definitely Bigfoot, because I didn't see or did any of this. But I find things like this, which is really interesting. This is one of the things that I'll talk a little bit more about as we go along, but it's difficult to see maybe for some of you guys, but this is actually kind of balanced on top of this log. And we find that often with this fulcrum type. I call them fulcrums because it's kind of like a seesaw effect, right? It's almost like something's placing something on top of something else. That by itself, you wouldn't get my knickers in a wall, right? But you start doing the totality of the circumstances. That's how I kind of operate when it comes to evidence, right? If I just found that in my woods, I'd be like, it's interesting, but it could be normal. Just fell that way, whatever. But the more we hike, it tends to be, I don't know if you can see that or not, that's not connected to the ground. That's like the bottom of the tree. It's kind of put between the middle of an X. We've heard of X's, right? That's a big thing in Bigfoot. If you're really into Bigfoot, you hear that a lot. And you'll see a couple more pictures of X's in here as we go along. I'm not a big proponent of, Bigfoot makes every X, because things tend to fall from trees and they end up in an X formation all the time. But when you see something like that is balanced, top of an X, that's one more layer for me to go. That's really strange. I don't know how that happened. I think that's another, that's a different tree. Kind of similar to the first picture, like 2 pictures ago, right? This really stuck out to me. It was really strange to me because it's difficult to see, but this is a pretty large, at its largest, it's probably 9-10 inches around. It's a cedar tree, or a cedar log. And it's completely off the ground. That's stuck through here. That's through here. And it's difficult to see in this picture. I've taken some other pictures. I couldn't include everything, obviously, because I don't have all the to pontificate about all the photos I took. However, there's no football fields. There's no tree nearby. This fell out. This was placed in its position, as you see it. Was it a person? I didn't do it. We didn't do it. But it got there somehow. And I'm finding this over and over in this size, smaller, bigger. Again, kind of woven behind. And here's the thing that I do as a researcher when I'm going in the woods, just to, I guess you could call this tip, if you will. Pretty common sense stuff, but if I'm looking at something like this, I try to see if it's natural. I'm trying to eliminate it, right? So I go up to something and I say, well, if this failed, so this tree fell first. If this one fell, it would fall on top of it, right? If another one falls, it would have to fall on top of it. It can't fall underneath the first one. That's impossible. So you start unwinding the puzzle backwards. And when you see some of these things, you get really into the moment. It's difficult to see the photo, obviously. At least it's not blurry, right? But it's difficult to see in the photo, but if you start going into some of these pictures, you see them. Like, one will fall here, the back is on this side. it gets complicated, but something is creating. You get to the point where it's got to be one of two things. It's either a person or something is creating what you're seeing. This is something that I found interesting, that I found in so many different places, not only on my property, but our neighbor's property. This is actually on a neighbor's property, next door. Is this arch this is a sapling, obviously it's still live, it's green, it's pulled over, and what's very difficult to see is that this end of this is stuck underneath this large log that's laying on the ground. Now this tree's been on the ground for a while, this didn't fall yesterday, but something has taken, or somebody has taken this and stuck it underneath that tree for some reason. I don't know the reason. I don't even pretend to know the reason, but something did it, right? That is a picture of Danny standing next to about a 9-foot tall teepee tree that we found while we were on a hike. I don't know how that would happen naturally. We didn't do it, we didn't put it there. This is actually not on our property, it's on our neighbor's property, which is about a mile up the road, maybe 3/4 of a mile from us on the opposite side of our street that we live on. But we were on a hike and came upon this. It's very near what you just saw the previous photo, where that was stuck underneath the log that was on the ground. Again, I don't know how that would happen, but it is an X that's up off the ground, stuck behind and underneath that other log that's laying there. Trying to get my clicker to work. Oh, there it is. Next slide. I'm not a huge tree break guy. It's a lot more difficult for me to figure out tree breaks. You know, it's sort of synonymous when it comes to Bigfoot, but trees break all the time, right? So it's a little difficult for me to determine if it was a natural break or not, but there's ways to go through it. And then the X on the ground, is that natural? I don't know. Oh, that's a little better view of another tree, very similar to the longer one that we showed you. It was stuck between underneath this log. Found several of those. That's actually on our property. This was very interesting. We had hiked a different part of the property, and I found a footprint, which you're going to see in a second, that was very near this. We're going along. I think I've got 2 pictures of this. This is a large evergreen, a pine tree, and the butt end of this tree, the root end of it, is sticking straight up in the air, and that is stuck into the side of an embankment into a hole. They didn't fall that naturally. I don't think it fell that naturally. I can't find any way to naturally explain that tree being there, but it was there. I certainly couldn't figure it out. So, anybody familiar with tide standing? I see people laughing already. I say tide standing, hands go. So, I won't get into the backstory, but I've had a long sort of history with tide. I've made no qualms about calling tide a hoaxer in the past. I do believe these videos are hoax. We can talk about that afterwards if you disagree, but I eventually got taught. I had Les Stroud, Survivor Man. If you guys are familiar with that show, Survivor Man. I had Les on the show a couple of years ago. And we talked a lot about Todd, because he had been out with Todd, but Todd wouldn't come on my show. So after I had Les on the show, Todd came on the show. And he kind of threw down the gauntlet. He said, hey, if you don't believe my stuff's real, why don't you come up to Canada, come up to my research area and rate it, and I'll show you what I'm finding. So guess what I did last October? I went to radio and spent a week in the woods with Todd standing. This is one of the first areas that we came to. This is actually called the radiant research area. That is what Todd would consider a good tree break that a Sasquatch made. He calls those clean breaks. And you can see, there's no connection here. It's just a clean snap, right? Because there's a couple of, I think I've included some photos of not so clean. But this is just a little bit of a run through of what we found in Radiant when I was up there last October. It's kind of hard to see the photos again, but there's some X's here going on. Some of these trees are broken up here, and then you've got these that are kind of woven in behind each other. Interesting. I found that very interesting. It almost makes like a triangle shape. Something has stuck this, so this is completely off the ground. The end of this tree is sticking off the ground. This one's stuck through. You've got a triangle here. I mean, how many times have you seen something that looked like that naturally in the woods? I've never seen it. And that was a lot of what we were finding in Radiant. Very interesting. I guess you would call that an X, but you've got another tree that was stuck over. This isn't connected to anything on this side. It's just stuck in between there, and then the X is formed here. That could certainly happen naturally. Could be snow load, could be wind blown, could be a natural occurrence. It just didn't, it stuck out to me as lots of the photo. I don't think it was natural. Again, could that have happened naturally? Sure. If you go down and break it in and see, could that have fallen and then that fall between those two and make that? And sure. It's just really strange to me. And again, it's the totality of the circumstances. In this area, I'm going to show you here in a second. I'm going to speed up and get through some of these photos. But we're finding footprints. Right? I found trackways while I was there in these areas. Todd wasn't leading me to these trackways. I literally went anywhere I wanted to go, and I found trackways that he didn't know existed. So I think there's activity going on. I think there's something strange happening. Something certainly, in my opinion, making some of these things, doing some of the tree breaks that we see. And there were certainly things making footprints. That's a tree break at the top there. And then these smaller trees were stuck in here in this formation of the seas. Again, did that just break naturally? Could have been. I'll get through some of the more interesting stuff. That's Kyle. He was one of the guys that was with me on the expedition I did. He was showing scale. Kyle's about 5'8", and that's where the tree break is. It's kind of difficult to see here, but it's a very clean break, or what they would consider to be a clean tree break. Subjective, but interesting. That just sticks out to me, right? I don't know how that would happen naturally. I don't know why a Bigfoot would do it. I don't know why Sasquatch would choose to stick those trees that way. Does it mean something to them? I don't know. But I thought it was very interesting to find these things over and over. Now this is a ground level shot of this, obviously one tree in the middle. And those could have all fallen that way? Sure. Didn't look natural to me. Again, there with the band. If you see, this is a pretty intricate thing happening here. There's Kyle, so he's 5'8", so you can see about how high that is. But we've got this beam. This comes all the way up, and it's bent over, and it's stuck behind that tree in that bend. So I'm finding that similar thing in North Carolina. And now I'm in Radiant, BC, Canada, finding the same thing. We're 18 miles deep in the woods. Todd's research area is 18 miles off the nearest lobby road. We're 30 miles off of the nearest blacktop road. So we're deep in the woods. Again, there there's so many pictures that I took of that area with similar things that we're seeing as far as the trees. I couldn't include them. Very close-up shot of what he considers to be a Sasquatch tree break. I did an experiment trying to break a tree very similar to that and cause the same thing. I had the video posted on my Bigfoot BKS on Instagram. It was difficult. I was able to do it, but I could not replicate what we're seeing as far as what he considers to be these tree breaks. That's a gifting site where Todd has had claimed to have had several visual encounters with Bigfoot. That's apples that you see there stuck on the tree. They take apples often. We had apples taken while I was at the research area as well. So this is one of the most interesting things that we found. We actually stumbled across this my last 4 day on expedition, so I'm leaving the next day. We go through an old growth of the forest that we'd never been in. 7 days I was there, we hadn't been in. And Todd said he'd never been in that area either. Because there's old growth forest on the backside of where the research is typically. We're walking along and we find this, we estimate it to be about 325-year-old tree. And there are these 80 to 90 foot trees here, and there's a third one on the other side of the tree that are sticking straight up, and they come together at a point at the top of the tree. As best we can tell, there's probably less than 2 inches separated at the top of all 3 of these trees that come together. And there's no root ball for any of these trees that you see. Todd actually has a video up on this Savannah Bigfoot. He went back, I think, 4 or 5 days after we left this expedition, and you see him physically digging at the bottom of one of these trees. There's no root ball. It was placed. And you can see the water damage on the bottom side of the trees where they've laid on the ground. There's no water damage on the other side. There's water damage on the bottom side. So they were clearly on the ground at some point. You would need heavy equipment to lift these trees. Nobody's doing that. It's taking 80 feet up into the tree. And there they are coming up at the top. They come together at a point. These two are almost touching on this side of the tree. And then the one on the back side, if you cut straight through the tree, they would probably be less than 2 inches. And one of them is directly due south, the other one's due north. And the one is off slightly east-west, which I thought was kind of significant. And there's some tree breaks around us that point to this particular tree. Oh no, I wanted to get to some of the